It was supposed to be a perfect summer morning, August 15th, 1975. A quiet town in Pennsylvania was just waking up. The sun hung low in the sky, warm, peaceful, the kind of morning where nothing felt wrong. 8-year-old Gretchen Harrington clutched her Bible and stepped outside. She had no idea she was walking straight into a nightmare. She never came back, and for nearly half a century, no one could explain why. Brumel, Pennsylvania, a place where children ran barefoot through the woods, where neighbors left their doors unlocked, where Sunday mornings were sacred. Gretchen's father, a beloved pastor, was preparing for service that day. Her mother was still in the hospital, having just given birth to a new baby girl. The house was quiet, but Gretchen had a routine. She was bright, curious, deeply religious. She never missed Sunday school, and she didn't want to break her perfect record. Normally, her older sisters walked with her, but that morning they stayed home to wait for their mother. Gretchen's father encouraged her to go on ahead. So, Bible in hand, dressed in the blue zip-up shorts her mother had sewn herself, Gretchen stepped outside alone. The walk was short, barely a mile, just 8 minutes through the familiar neighborhood. She'd walked it dozens of times. What could go wrong? The Sunday school routine was simple. Children gathered first at Trinity Church, about a mile from Gretchen's house. Then, halfway through the morning, they were driven in groups to Reformed Presbyterian Church, her father's church. That's where he waited. But at 11:30 a.m., as the children arrived from Trinity, something was off. Gretchen wasn't there. At first, her father assumed she'd stayed at Trinity. Maybe she'd gotten distracted. Maybe she felt sick. He picked up the phone and made the first call that would change everything. On the other end of the line was the wife of Pastor David Zandstra. She checked with her husband. No, they said. Gretchen wasn't there. She hadn't shown up at all. That's when panic started to flicker in her father's chest. She wouldn't just skip class. Not Gretchen. Her father got into the car, drove the route she would have taken, checked the street corners, neighborhood yards, friends' houses. Nothing. He asked around. No one had seen her. She never made it to either church. She'd vanished somewhere in between. Just disappeared. The police were called. Soon, word spread through Brumel like wildfire. Hundreds of people, neighbors, strangers, fellow church members, came out to search. They scoured streets, creeks, backyards. Flyers with her photo were stapled to telephone poles, handed to passing drivers, mailed to nearby towns. The woods were combed inch by inch. A helicopter circled overhead. Still, no sign of Gretchen. By nightfall, the streets were dark and quiet. But the silence had changed. It was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, unsettling. And the longer Gretchen remained missing, the more terrified this town became. Brumel had never seen anything like this. This was a town where kids stayed out until the streetlights came on, where girls rode their bikes alone and boys played by the river without adults nearby. But that ended with Gretchen. Suddenly, every parent in town was on high alert. One mother even cut her daughter's long hair short, hoping she'd look more like a boy, hoping it would keep her safe. The innocence of an entire town was gone in one morning. Theories swirled. Had she run away? Was there an accident? Maybe she'd fallen in the river? But deep down, everyone feared the same terrible possibility. Someone had taken her. A stranger. A predator. Or worse, someone they knew. Then came the witness tips. Someone saw a green station wagon pull up near a little girl walking alone that morning. Another claimed it was a white Cadillac. Police tracked down every owner of those vehicles. Nothing. For days later, hope flickered again. A resident in Westchester, 30 minutes away, found a pair of children's shorts. They looked like Gretchen's, but when her mother saw them, she shook her head. No, they weren't her daughters. Weeks passed. The search teams grew smaller. The flyers began to fade in the sun. The town returned to a routine. But everything was different. Gretchen's sisters still set her place at dinner. Her father still opened his sermons with a quiet glance at the empty pew. And her mother had to hold a newborn while mourning a child who was simply gone. If this story gripped you, don't scroll just yet. We're only getting started. Chapter 2 is where the horror deepens and the town begins to break. Subscribe, hit the bell icon, and stay with us. Justice may be slow, but we follow it to the end. The woods no longer felt safe. The streets no longer silent. After Gretchen Harrington vanished, Brumel, Pennsylvania, transformed overnight. This was no longer the kind of place where kids wandered off to play. It was the kind of place where an 8-year-old could vanish on her way to church and no one could explain how. And after weeks of desperate searching, the community's hope was starting to rot. Search teams had come and gone. Helicopters, police dogs, flyers, rivers searched with poles and nets. No torn Bible pages. No footprints. No clues. It was as if Gretchen had been swallowed by the earth. Her family clung to faith. But faith without answers was agony. And then came the jogger. October 14th, 1975. A man out for his morning run near Ridley Creek State Park, about 20 minutes from Brumel, noticed something strange. A disturbance in the bushes. He stepped closer, and what he saw froze him in place. It wasn't an animal. It was a body. The police arrived quickly. The remains were skeletal, fragile, almost hidden beneath branches, but the clothes had been folded. Neatly, carefully, deliberately. It was a detail that made the scene even more chilling. Whoever had left her here wanted her hidden, but not discarded, or maybe they felt guilt. Maybe they didn't want to see what they'd done. The clothes matched what Gretchen was last seen wearing. Blue shorts with front studs, a white shirt. When her mother saw them, she broke. She'd made those shorts herself. No doubt, it was Gretchen. Forensic testing confirmed it. The Harringtons' daughter had been found. But their nightmare wasn't over. It had only changed form. Dental records matched, and then came the harder part. The autopsy. Gretchen had been struck repeatedly in the head. Blunt force trauma. Multiple blows. The attack had been brutal, angry, personal, but decomposition made everything else impossible to confirm. No DNA, no fingerprints, no evidence of sexual assault. Only silence, only questions. The case was now officially reclassified as homicide. But investigators were running on fumes. The killer had left no trail. And this wasn't 2024. This was 1975. There were no security cameras, no cell phones, no forensic databases, and no witnesses had seen Gretchen get into a car. Only vague reports, a green station wagon, a white Cadillac, no plates, no names, no suspects, just ghost vehicles and a growing fear. The town grieved, but grief quickly turned to something else. Paranoia. No one was above suspicion, not neighbors, not teachers, not pastors. Anyone could be hiding something, and when people started talking, they started remembering. Some said they'd seen a man near the park the day Gretchen vanished. Others recalled a green car loitering near the church. Dozens of tips poured in. The police chased each one. But every trail died in the same place, nowhere. Weeks passed, then months. The leads dried up, and the town was left with a gaping hole and a name no one could stop whispering. David Zandstra, a pastor, a family man, a pillar of the community. He'd been one of the last adults connected to Gretchen before her disappearance. He was the one who reported her missing to the police, and he gave a surprisingly detailed description of what she was wearing that day. Too detailed. How could he know? He'd said he never saw her. And yet he described her outfit down to the buttons on her shorts. Investigators took note, but didn't have enough to pursue him. At least, not yet. By 1976, the case had gone cold. Officially, it was still open. But unofficially, it was history. Gretchen Harrington became a story parents told their kids to warn them about strangers. Her face faded from flyers. Her name disappeared from headlines. Only her family remembered every day. Only her mother looked out the window, wondering what might have happened if her daughter had just stayed home that morning. But this wasn't the end, because nearly 5 decades later, someone would come forward. Someone who remembered something dark, something no child should have had to carry. And it would crack the case wide open. In the meantime, life moved on. David Zandstra left town. He took his family, his ministry, and disappeared into another community, another pulpit, another town where no one knew what happened in Brummel. He was free, respected, above suspicion, and Gretchen's killer walked among churches and classrooms for decades, completely unnoticed, until someone started writing a book, until secrets buried for decades began to resurface, and a survivor decided she couldn't stay silent anymore. In Chapter 3, we'll follow the long road to justice through dusty case files, buried trauma, and the voice that finally shattered the silence. Don't miss it. What if your town's most trusted leader was hiding a monstrous secret? The answers are coming in Chapter 3. Subscribe now. Hit the bell, because this case is about to break wide open, and it gets darker from here. 48 years. That's how long it took. For nearly half a century, Gretchen Harrington's murder sat in silence. Cold. Forgotten. Her name filed away in dusty cabinets. But secrets have a way of surfacing, especially when the people keeping them start slipping. And in 2023, someone finally talked. It started with a book. A local true crime writer was working on a manuscript about unsolved crimes in Pennsylvania. The Gretchen Harrington case kept coming up. A case that should have gone somewhere, but never did. People remembered the story. They remembered the fear. But there was always one name that came up again and again. David Zandstra. He was the pastor of Trinity Chapel Church. Trusted, charismatic, kind. He had kids of his own, a wife, a gentle smile. But behind the collar, some people always felt something was off. And one woman finally decided she was done keeping a secret. She'd known him as a child. She said that years ago, he tried to lure her into his car. She was only 10. It happened near a church, just like with Gretchen. Same type of situation. Same pattern. But she never told anyone. Until now. She came forward with her story. And suddenly, the cold case was hot again. Police took the tip seriously. And when they pulled Zandstra's old statements from 1975, something jumped out. He had lied. Back then, he told police he hadn't seen Gretchen that morning. But now, the new witness said the opposite. He had seen her. He had tried the same tactics on multiple girls. They had escaped. Gretchen had not. By now, Zandstra was 83 years old, living in Marietta, Georgia, a retired pastor, still married, still respected, still carrying a secret, until Pennsylvania State Police knocked on his door. And this time, he didn't lie. He confessed. After 48 years, he broke. He told detectives everything. He said he saw Gretchen walking alone that morning. He offered her a ride. She trusted him. He was a man of God, a friend of her father. He said she got in the car willingly. She had no idea it would be the last decision of her life. He drove her to a wooded area, told her to take off her clothes. When she refused, he snapped. He punched her, hit her again, and again, and again, until she was still, until she stopped moving, and then he left her there. Like a secret, like trash, Zandstra admitted to everything. He even admitted he folded her clothes before fleeing the scene. It wasn't mercy. It was control. He wanted to stage it, to send a message no one could understand. And for years he walked free, smiling in church, baptizing children, shaking hands, comforting parents who had no idea what he was capable of. Police arrested him immediately. The community was stunned, but also validated. Some had always suspected him. Others had no idea. But now, the truth was undeniable. Zandstra was charged with criminal homicide, kidnapping, and the murder of Gretchen Harrington. The monster hiding in plain sight had finally been unmasked. For Gretchen's family, the confession reopened old wounds. But it also brought something they never expected. Justice. Her father, now elderly and frail, finally heard the words he waited 48 years to hear. We got him. Her sisters, grown women now, stood in court holding back tears. Her memory had never left them. And now, neither would the truth. But there was still one final twist. After the arrest, more victims began to come forward. Women who had once attended Zandstra's Sunday school. Girls who remembered things they were too afraid to say out loud back then. He had been grooming, targeting, terrifying for years. And Gretchen wasn't the first child he'd approached. She was just the one who didn't make it home. The trial is still pending. Zandstra is old, weak. His lawyer may push for a plea. But the truth is out, and the Harringtons are no longer alone in their grief. Now the world knows. Now the mask is off. And the story of Gretchen Harrington isn't just a cold case anymore. It's a warning. In Chapter 4, we'll explore how Zandstra hid in plain sight, using religion, status, and fear to protect himself, and how the community is still dealing with the betrayal. You think you know your town, your church, your neighbors, but predators don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like pastors. Subscribe. Turn on notifications. Chapter 4 is coming, and it's going to leave you questioning everything. He wasn't a drifter. He wasn't some shadowy figure lurking in alleys. David Zandstra was a pastor, a father, a friend of the Harrington family. He baptized children. He led prayers. He stood behind the pulpit and spoke of God's mercy, even as he carried a monster inside him. So, how did he get away with it? Simple. He was exactly who no one suspected. Zandstra's weapon wasn't a knife. It wasn't a gun. It was his reputation. He built a shield of trust, layer by layer, and for years it kept him untouchable. He wore a preacher's smile, a shepherd's voice, and he hid behind stained glass. But the truth? It was there, in the whispers, the strange stories, the moments no one wanted to believe. There had always been red flags. One woman remembered him trying to lure her into his car when she was 10. She said he used the exact same line he used on Gretchen. "Your parents asked me to pick you up." She got scared, ran home. Gretchen didn't. But when she told adults what happened, they brushed it off. Zandstra? He would never. That's how predators operate. They don't need to hide in darkness. They hide in plain sight. Churches, schools, tight-knit communities where questioning authority feels like a sin. Zandstra moved freely through Delaware County. He held positions of influence: teacher, counselor, spiritual guide. He was the kind of man people trusted their kids with. And that trust? It was his camouflage. After Gretchen disappeared, police interviewed Zandstra. He said he hadn't seen her that morning. That was a lie. And yet, no one pressed further. Because who questions a pastor? Instead, detectives turned their attention elsewhere. The woods, convicted sex offenders, even random strangers. But the man who did it? He went back to his Sunday sermon. Zandstra didn't stop being a pastor after Gretchen. In fact, he kept rising. He moved to Texas, then to California, eventually settling in Georgia. Everywhere he went, he carried masks, he led churches, he performed weddings, he counseled struggling families. All the while, Gretchen's secret stayed buried with her. And his guilt? Tucked behind a Bible. It's easy to ask how this happened, but the better question is, why did no one stop it? Fear, respect, denial. Communities like Marple Township are built on trust. Zandstra used that trust like a weapon, and it worked. He created a bubble where doubt felt like betrayal, where questioning him made you the sinner. When his name resurfaced in 2023, it shocked people. Some refused to believe it. Others weren't surprised at all. They said they always had a strange feeling. He was too controlling, too familiar with kids, too quick to isolate certain girls after church. But in the 70s, those weren't warning signs. They were just quirks. Zandstra wasn't just hiding from justice, he was hiding from consequences. And it worked. For 48 years, he built a life, a family, a career, all on the grave of an 8-year-old girl. But no mask lasts forever. When detectives finally confronted him in Georgia, the cracks showed. At first, he denied everything. But once the pressure built, once he realized they knew more than he thought, he broke. He confessed not just to murder, but to the pattern, to the attempts, to the girls who escaped, and the one who didn't. His arrest did something extraordinary. It unlocked memories. Other victims, now adults, came forward. One remembered Zandstra reaching out to touch her inappropriately in Sunday school. Another said he offered her candy to ride along with him to pick up supplies. All of them carried that shame for decades. But now, they finally said his name out loud. Zandstra built his world on silence. He relied on fear. He relied on shame. But the truth is louder. And now the town that once revered him is tearing down his legacy, one testimony at a time. What do you do when the person who preached heaven dragged your child into hell? That's what the Harrington family is still wrestling with. They were friends. Their daughters played together. Gretchen's father once shook Zandstra's hand, never knowing that hand would later bury his child. Marple Township hasn't recovered. Not really. Because how do you process that kind of betrayal? How do you heal when the monster wore robes and quoted scripture? When the evil didn't come from outside, but from inside the church? In Chapter 5, we go deeper. The confession tape, the courtroom drama, and the ripple effect of finally, after decades of silence, bringing a predator to justice. If this story has shaken you, you're not alone. Evil doesn't always look like we expect. Subscribe now, because Chapter 5 is where the reckoning begins. David Zandstra sat in an interrogation room. The air was sterile, the walls silent. He was 83 years old. He looked harmless, wrinkled, gray-haired, wearing a sweater vest. But beneath that frail exterior was a man who had hidden a child's murder for nearly 5 decades. This was the moment, the reckoning. He thought he could lie his way out. He'd done it before. So, when detectives flew from Pennsylvania to Georgia and sat across from him, he smiled politely, acted confused, said he didn't know anything about Gretchen Harrington's disappearance. I don't remember that day very well, he claimed. It's been so long. But the investigators weren't buying it. Because this time, they had leverage. They told him they had a statement from a woman who said Zandstra tried to abduct her in the 70s, using the same line he used on Gretchen. They told him other women were coming forward. They knew about the secrets, the dark urges, the pattern, and suddenly his confidence cracked. Detective recreated transcript style. David, we know you picked her up that day. We know what happened. This is your chance to tell the truth before someone else tells it for you. There was a long silence. Zandstra looked down. His hands trembled. And then he confessed. He told them everything, with chilling detail, that he offered Gretchen a ride to Bible camp that morning, that she trusted him because he was a family friend, a pastor, that instead of taking her to church, he drove her to a secluded park nearby. He pulled the car over. He told her to take off her clothes. She refused. She screamed. So he punched her in the head with his fist, hard, until she stopped screaming. Narrator quiet, solemn. Then he said he dragged her into the woods and killed her. No emotion, no tears, just cold, matter-of-fact horror. He even said afterwards he went back to church, back to the congregation, back to the pulpit, like nothing had happened. And for years, no one suspected. When the confession made it back to Pennsylvania, it was like a bomb dropped in Marple Township. People who had gone to that church, who'd let their kids ride in his car, who'd attended his sermons for years, they were stunned, because now it was real. This wasn't just a cold case anymore. It was a solved one. Zandstra was arrested in Cobb County, Georgia, July 17th, 2023. He was charged with criminal homicide, kidnapping of a minor, possession of an instrument of crime, and more. His mugshot went viral. A once respected pastor, now labeled a predator. At his extradition hearing, the courtroom was filled with tension. Some couldn't look at him. Others stared, trying to understand how this mild-mannered old man could be a killer. Zandstra barely spoke, didn't cry, didn't apologize. He just sat there, cold, empty, like a man who had finally run out of lies. And yet, something was missing. Why? Why now? Why confess after 48 years? The answer was chilling in its simplicity. I didn't want to die with this on my conscience, he reportedly said. It wasn't guilt. It wasn't remorse. It was fear of God's judgment. But here's the thing. The Harringtons didn't get a confession because he wanted to make peace. They got it because he was cornered, because brave women finally spoke up, because detectives didn't stop digging, because the town didn't forget Gretchen. Still, questions hung in the air. Were there other victims? Did he ever assault girls in his congregations across Texas, California, and Georgia? How many families trusted him and never knew? The investigation continues. But one thing is clear. Gretchen Harrington was never just missing. She was murdered by someone her family trusted with their lives. And now, justice has a name. So does the monster. And no title, no robe, no reputation can hide the truth anymore. But this story doesn't end in a courtroom. It lives on in the survivors, in the children who got away, in the voices that were silenced but are now being heard. In Chapter 6, The Aftermath, how a small town grapples with betrayal, faith, and the question that haunts every parent. How do you move on when the killer lived next door? We're not done yet. Chapter 6 uncovers the ripple effects, the community scars, and how justice doesn't always mean closure. Subscribe now, because we're just getting to the heart of it. Marple Township was quiet again, but it wasn't peaceful. The streets hadn't changed. The church still stood. The parks still echoed with the laughter of children. But everything felt different now, because the truth was out, and it shattered something deeper than trust. It cracked the very foundation of faith. People who had lived side by side with David Zandstra, who'd prayed with him, sang hymns with him, trusted him with their kids, now looked back and wondered, how didn't we see it? For nearly 5 decades, he walked among them, wore the mask of a man of God. He baptized babies, gave sermons on forgiveness, spoke about morality and sin, all while hiding the darkest sin imaginable. Local resident, he was just part of the community. We never thought, never imagined, someone like him could be capable of that. The day his name was released as the confessed killer of Gretchen Harrington, the shock rippled like a stone thrown into still water. People dug out old yearbooks, church bulletins, photos from summer Bible camp. There he was, smiling, preaching, standing just feet away from the very people he'd betrayed. Some community members remembered subtle oddities, a glance that lingered too long, rules about never being alone with him, whispers behind closed doors that no one wanted to confront. But back then it was the 70s. People didn't talk about predators, especially if they wore a collar and spoke the gospel. Then came the anger, not just at Zandstra, but at the system. How many people did he fool across states? Why weren't earlier allegations taken seriously? Did churches protect him? People asked if Zandstra moved so often, not for new opportunities, but to stay ahead of suspicion. And at the center of it all was Gretchen. Her name was everywhere again. Newspaper headlines, vigils, podcasts. But this time, it wasn't just about a missing girl. It was about a stolen future. A child who could have been someone's mother, someone's teacher, someone's everything, but never got the chance. The Harrington family had waited 48 years. Her father, Reverend Harold Harrington, had passed away without knowing the truth. Her mother, still alive in her 90s, received the news with quiet devastation. Her sisters, overwhelmed by the cruelty of the truth, by the knowledge that he was always right there. And it raised deeper questions. What does justice look like when it's this late? Can a confession undo decades of lies? Can a town ever truly heal when the wound was caused by one of its own? Some sought comfort in faith. Others turned away from it completely. One local pastor said it best. This case tested more than our faith in people. It tested our belief in redemption and reminded us that wolves don't always look like wolves. Psychologists and victim advocates were called in, not just for the Harringtons, but for the entire community. Because what Zandstra did wasn't just murder. It was betrayal, abuse of power, emotional trauma buried under decades of silence. And the more people spoke up, the more stories emerged. Women who now realized what almost happened to them. Adults recalling moments that felt off as children. congregants wondering what else Zandstra was capable of, and so justice for Gretchen sparked something bigger. A reckoning, a movement to review cold cases, to investigate faith institutions more thoroughly, to empower survivors, even decades later, to speak out. But for many, it wasn't about grand justice or policy change. It was about one little girl, a child who left home in pigtails holding a Bible and never came back. Narrator, soft, heartfelt. They put up new flowers at the memorial. They lit candles. They whispered prayers. And someone placed a sign under the cross where her name was carved. We never stopped looking. We never stopped loving. And now we know. Zandstra may live out the rest of his life behind bars, or in a hospital wing, or perhaps even in solitary silence. But the town will never forget what he took. Because the story of Gretchen Harrington isn't just a cautionary tale. It's a reminder that evil doesn't always wear masks. Sometimes it stands at the pulpit, shakes your hand, sits beside you at Sunday lunch. In Chapter 7, we return to the investigation's turning point. How one woman's memory blew the case wide open, and how the quiet bravery of survivors finally pierced the silence. If you've made it this far, it means you care. Join us for Chapter 7 as we dive into the crucial break in the case. This story isn't over, and neither is the pursuit of truth. Subscribe, share, and stay with us, because justice echoes louder than silence. 48 years. That's how long Gretchen Harrington's case remained cold. No leads, no suspects, no answers. But then someone spoke. A woman. An ordinary woman with an extraordinary memory. And what she remembered changed everything. She didn't come forward for attention. She wasn't part of the investigation. She didn't even live in Marple Township anymore. But in 2023, after reading about renewed interest in the case, she felt something stir. A memory she'd buried for nearly 5 decades. A feeling she could no longer ignore. She picked up the phone, called the Delaware County District Attorney's office, and said 6 words that would crack the silence wide open. I need to talk about Gretchen. At first, detectives were cautious. Over the years, many had come forward with theories, tips, suspicions. Most went nowhere. But this woman, she wasn't guessing. She remembered details, names, dates, and most importantly, David Zandstra. The woman had been 10 years old in 1975. She was friends with Gretchen, and with Gretchen's sisters. She'd spent the night at their house, played in the yard, laughed with them at church picnics. They were just kids. But even then, something felt wrong. She told investigators that one night, she stayed over at a mutual friend's house, 2 sisters, and in the middle of the night, she woke up to someone touching her, a hand on her body, a shadow standing in the doorway. It was the girl's father, David Zandstra. The next night, it happened again. He entered the room, stood over her, touched her. She was terrified, but frozen. She didn't scream, didn't run. She just waited for it to stop. And the next morning, she told one of the sisters what the girl said in response would haunt her forever. Oh, he does that sometimes. The abuse was normalized, hidden, passed off as something weird Dad does. But it was a warning sign, a flashing red light in a world that didn't want to see. And worse, this happened just 1 week before Gretchen disappeared. The woman told her parents. But in those days, there was no hotline, no training, no language for what she was trying to say. Her parents' solution? They told her she couldn't sleep over there anymore. That was it. No police report, no charges, just silence and shame. But the woman never forgot, especially when, just days later, Gretchen vanished. A girl she knew, a friend, gone. And the man she feared was the last one to see her. The woman kept a diary, a small spiral notebook with a pink cover. She brought it with her to the interview. And there, on a page dated September 15th, 1975, was a handwritten entry. She had written about a friend who was almost abducted by a man in a car who matched the description of David Zandstra. The diary entry ended with this sentence: "She made me promise not to tell, because she's scared he'll come back. It was real. It was raw. And it was enough. Detectives leaned forward. The past had just spoken. Loud and clear. The woman gave them more than memory. She gave them motive, pattern, access. She wasn't speculating, she was remembering. And her account connected dots that had stayed scattered for decades. Zandstra was suddenly no longer a pillar of the community. He was a predator in plain sight. And this woman? She was the catalyst, the voice that broke the silence. Because of her, the case was reopened. Because of her, detectives revisited old evidence with new eyes. And because of her, justice finally stirred from its grave. She didn't want fame. She didn't want revenge. She just wanted the truth. To be heard. To be believed. And she was. We often think heroes wear badges, carry guns, solve crimes in laboratories. But sometimes heroes carry scars. Scars they've kept hidden. For decades. Until one day, they choose to speak. And in this case, that voice was everything. The match, the key, the light that finally touched the darkest corner of a very old, very painful room. David Zandstra may never fully face justice. He's old. His lawyers may stall. His health may fail. But the woman who remembered, she ensured the world knows exactly who he is. And what he did. Coming up in Chapter 8, The Legal Reckoning, how the court is handling Zandstra's confession, and the national conversation this case has reignited. You've stayed with us through 7 chapters of truth, heartbreak, and bravery. Don't stop now. Subscribe, share, and meet us in Chapter 8, because justice demands that we keep going. In July 2023, the past finally caught up to David Zandstra. He was arrested in his quiet home in Cobb County, Georgia, a suburban neighborhood, nice lawns, friendly neighbors, and a monster hiding in plain sight. He was 83 years old, a grandfather, a retired pastor, a man who had lived half a century as if nothing ever happened. But behind his polite exterior was a predator who had never once shown remorse. Until now, or so it seemed, when detectives confronted him, Zandstra folded shockingly fast. He admitted to everything. He told them how he had seen Gretchen walking to Bible camp that morning, how he lured her into his car, how he took her into the woods near Ridley Creek State Park, and how, when she refused to take off her clothes, he killed her. Just like that. He said it was a moment of rage, that he didn't plan it, that he panicked, but he also described covering her body with leaves and walking away. Narrator with tension. Detectives were stunned. This wasn't just a confession. It was specific. It matched the location, the timeline, even Gretchen's last known steps. Finally, justice. Or so they thought, because just weeks later, David Zandstra recanted his entire confession. He said it wasn't true, that he had felt pressured to say what detectives wanted to hear, that he was confused, that at 83, he wasn't in the right state of mind. Narrator, low and cold. It was the kind of reversal that guts a case. One moment, you have a full confession. The next, you have an old man with a lawyer, arguing that he's too frail, too sick, or too forgetful to stand trial. But the DA didn't back down. They charged Zandstra with criminal homicide and pushed for trial, because now they had his taped confession, the woman's diary and testimony, the timeline, and a decades-long pattern of abuse. But here's the problem. Zandstra is 83 years old. The justice system moves slowly, and even if convicted, he may never live to serve his sentence. Narrator, thoughtful. So, what does justice look like when the suspect is closer to death than prison? Victims and advocates called for transparency. Some wanted him tried as quickly as possible. Others feared he might die in custody before any trial began. And many more wanted the case expanded because it was becoming clear Gretchen might not have been his only victim. Once his name hit national news, more women came forward. Stories of inappropriate behavior, of strange car rides, of being cornered at church events. None of them rose to the level of a murder charge, but All of them painted a picture of decades of manipulation and abuse. In Pennsylvania, investigators reopened multiple cold cases. In Georgia, detectives combed through decades of church records. In Texas and California, survivors were contacted. The ripple effect was massive. Narrator emotional. But the core of this case was still a little girl in pigtails who never came home. And the man who now says he didn't do it. David Zandstra was deemed competent to stand trial, but his attorneys are pushing hard, citing age, health, mental confusion. They're asking for delays, arguing the confession is unreliable, claiming Zandstra was coerced. Classic defense tactics, but in a case like this, every delay feels like another injustice. The Harrington family, now spread across generations, has remained quiet publicly, but privately, they are watching every hearing, reading every brief, waiting. They've waited 48 years. They're willing to wait a little longer. But what they want most is certainty, that he won't die a free man, that Gretchen's name will be spoken in a courtroom, and that the little girl in the leotard is not forgotten. The legal system may never deliver perfect justice, but for the first time in half a century, it's at least delivering answers. In Chapter 9, we go beyond the courtroom. We look at how Zandstra managed to hide for decades, and how many institutions helped him stay hidden. Churches, schools, families, all looking the other way, until it was too late. The next chapter is about complicity and cover-ups. Subscribe to learn how Zandstra moved freely across states and how the system enabled a predator to thrive. We're not done. Not by a long shot. David Zandstra didn't just get lucky. He didn't slip through the cracks by accident. He was protected by institutions, by silence, by a system built to forgive even the unforgivable. Let's go back to the beginning. In 1975, Zandstra was the pastor of Trinity Chapel Christian Reformed Church in Marple Township. He was respected. He was trusted. He was a man of God, and that gave him power. The kind of power that makes people ignore the warning signs. Because here's what we now know. Zandstra had a history of inappropriate behavior. He had been accused, more than once, of making young girls uncomfortable. One family even removed their daughter from the church entirely. But no reports were ever filed. No investigation. No church board intervention. Why? Because it was the 1970s. Because it was a church. And because no one wanted to believe a pastor could be dangerous. After Gretchen's disappearance, police briefly questioned Zandstra. He denied everything. They moved on. That was it. No lie detector. No search warrant. No follow-up. And the church? They didn't suspend him. They didn't confront him. They didn't ask questions. They let him keep preaching. Within 2 years, Zandstra relocated. And this is where the trail of protection gets even worse. Because he didn't stop. He kept moving. From Pennsylvania to California, to Georgia, to Texas, back to Georgia. Each move connected to a new church, a new congregation, a new group of children. No one flagged his behavior. No one checked his record. No one ever spoke up because no one knew. Or, if they did, they stayed quiet. Narrator, slow haunting. That silence? It cost lives. It cost childhoods. It cost Gretchen her future. And it allowed a predator to become a pastor again and again. In fact, Zandstra held pastoral roles up until the early 2000s. He retired with honors, was celebrated in church bulletins, was quoted in local papers, as if he was a man who had served faithfully. But behind the sermons and smiles was the same man who had dumped a little girl's body in the woods. When news of his arrest broke in 2023, it shook every community he had touched. Parents called each other. Churches scrambled to issue statements. Some denied knowing anything. Others, they quietly removed his name from websites and archives. But survivors noticed, especially one woman, the same girl who, in her childhood diary, called Zandstra the man I hate. She had come forward in 1975. She told her parents he tried to touch her. They told church elders. And what did they do? Nothing. No police report. No internal investigation. They just let him continue. She lived with that silence for 48 years, until his arrest validated everything she had been saying. She was right. They were wrong. And Gretchen paid the price. Narrator, sharp, direct. This isn't just about one man. It's about a system that values reputation over responsibility. Churches that fear scandal more than they fear the abusers among them. Communities that close ranks instead of asking hard questions. And Zandstra knew how to exploit that. He stayed under the radar because he understood the rules. Pastors are trusted. Churches don't report their own. Victims are afraid of not being believed. And let's be clear, this isn't just the church's failure. It's also law enforcement, schools, neighbors, everyone who shrugged off suspicions because it was easier to assume the best. So when people ask, how did David Zandstra get away with it for so long? The answer is simple, because we let him. Now, in 2025, that silence is breaking. Some churches have apologized. Some pastors have stepped forward. Some victims are telling their stories. But it's decades too late for Gretchen. And it raises a painful question. How many more David Zandstras are out there? Still protected? Still preaching? Still smiling in church directories? Chapter 10 is the aftermath. The trial is approaching. Zandstra is running out of excuses. And the Harringtons are preparing for the moment they've waited for since 1975. But will they get justice before time runs out? Stay with us. In the final chapter, we bring this haunting story full circle. The courtroom, the family, and the little girl whose voice was silenced but not forgotten. Subscribe, share, and keep Gretchen's name alive. On a crisp morning in 2023, a frail man in handcuffs shuffled into a Pennsylvania courtroom. David Zandstra, 83 years old, a former pastor, and the confessed killer of 8-year-old Gretchen Harrington. The courtroom was small, but what it lacked in size, it made up for in weight. Because this wasn't just a hearing, it was a moment nearly 50 years in the making. The families came, so did reporters. Even some of the women who had once feared him, now older themselves, sat quietly in the back row. Zandstra entered slowly, walking with a cane, but there was no sympathy in the room. Not for him. The prosecution opened with the confession. They played the recording in full. Zandstra's voice, matter of fact, almost casual, described how he killed a little girl who trusted him. The courtroom was dead silent. No one breathed. No one moved. The prosecutor painted a picture of manipulation. How Zandstra used his position as a pastor to hide. How he built a life of lies. How the church, the community, even his own family, were fooled for decades. But not anymore. They showed images of Gretchen. Not just crime scene photos, but pictures from her life. Gretchen laughing on a swing. Gretchen holding her Bible. Gretchen in her gymnastics leotard, full of dreams. It wasn't just a murder trial. It was a reminder of everything that was lost. The defense argued that the confession was invalid. They claimed Zandstra had been pressured, that he didn't fully understand his rights, that his age and memory made him unreliable. But they never denied his presence in the neighborhood, or his access to Gretchen, or his deeply disturbing pattern of behavior with other girls. The judge didn't rush. He let every word sit heavy in the air. When it came time for the families to speak, Gretchen's sister, now a mother herself, stood and addressed the man who had destroyed her childhood. Family member, voice trembling. You stole her. You buried her in the woods like trash. And then you went on preaching about forgiveness for yourself. Zandstra didn't respond. He just stared forward. Blank. No apology. No tears. And in that moment, the courtroom understood. He had buried more than Gretchen in those woods. He had buried any part of himself that felt guilt. In the end, the court ruled that the confession was admissible. The evidence held. And so did the charge of criminal homicide. Zandstra would be tried in full. But due to his age and declining health, the actual trial was scheduled for early 2024. A delay, but not an escape. The wheels of justice at last were turning. Outside the courthouse, reporters asked Gretchen's family what they felt. Closure? Relief? No. The answer was simple. We got truth. Not justice. But truth matters too. Today, David Zandstra sits in a Pennsylvania jail. His trial is pending. His fate uncertain. But Gretchen's story, after 48 years of silence, is finally being told. And in telling it, we're doing what the system didn't. We're saying her name. We're demanding answers. We're remembering the girl who trusted the wrong man and paid with her life. Gretchen Harrington was only 8. She should have come home that day. She should have grown up, lived, loved, laughed, but she didn't. And we will not let that be forgotten. If this story moved you, share Gretchen's name. Shine a light on the darkness that silenced her. Subscribe for more real stories, because truth deserves a voice,